Welcome to this special presentation from New Salem Baptist Church. Normally at this time, we would be taking you into our sanctuary for our Sunday morning worship service. Today, however, we're going to be bringing you a little something different. This morning in our live service, we will be hearing from one of the missionaries we support through the International Mission Board. Some of our missionaries are serving in places where it would be a little disruptive or maybe even dangerous if their identities were known. Believe it or not, there are actually groups and governments that scour the internet looking for clues to help them out suspected missionaries. So in order to protect our missionaries' safety today, we're not going to bring you the live service. Instead, we hope you'll enjoy this special presentation. Now, those of us who live in the United States are blessed to live in a nation where we can talk about Jesus openly and we can worship him openly. And we do not take that freedom for granted. Also, with America preparing to celebrate its 250th birthday here in just a few days, we thought this would be a great opportunity to think about why religious liberty is such a precious gift and why we should be diligent to protect it. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So begins the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, opening the section that we know today as the Bill of Rights. There's a reason that this provision protecting religious liberty is often called America's first freedom. There's a reason it's listed before the freedom of speech, before the freedom of the press, before the freedom of assembly, even before the freedom to petition the government for redress. The reason religious liberty is asserted first is because if the state can come between you and God, then nothing else is safe. And yet, religious liberty is perhaps one of the least understood and least appreciated rights enjoyed by Americans, even among people of faith. As American society becomes less religious and more secularized, we're in an increasing danger of taking religious liberty for granted. If we neglect America's first freedom, how long will it be before the rest of our freedoms are at risk as well? So, what is religious liberty? The Baptist Faith and Message 2000, which is the official confessional statement of the Southern Baptist Convention, declares, "A free church in a free state is the Christian ideal, and this implies the right of free and unhindered access to God on the part of all men, and the right to form and propagate opinions in the sphere of religion without interference from the civil power." The U.S. Department of Justice defines religious liberty as the fundamental right of all Americans to exercise their religion freely, without being coerced to join an established church or to satisfy a religious test as a qualification for public office. It also encompasses the right of all Americans to express their religious beliefs subject to the same narrow limits that apply to all forms of speech. True religious liberty includes the freedom to believe or not to believe, the freedom to worship, the freedom to live in accordance with one's beliefs, as long as doing so does not interfere with the rights of other people to do the same, and the freedom to proclaim one's beliefs in the public square. So where did this uniquely American concept of religious liberty come from? Well, down through the ages and across cultures, there have been groups who have promoted the idea of tolerance, though usually this has been the exception rather than the rule. However, tolerance does not always equal religious liberty. Tolerance says, we may not persecute you for your faith, but we reserve the right to penalize you and treat you as a second-class citizen. The modern concept of religious liberty has roots in several different sources. It has roots in ideas that flowed from the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, namely the doctrine of the priesthood of the believer, or as we Baptists like to call it, soul competency. It flows from the ideas of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, though some claim that religious liberty was a predicate for and not a result of the Enlightenment. Now, even though some groups came to America in search of religious liberty, most of the original colonies had some kind of official established church. That meant that those who refused to join those churches or who had dissents from the official doctrine often found themselves repressed, suppressed, or imprisoned, even in the colonies that became the United States. Among the earliest and most vocal proponents of religious liberty in the colonies were the people known as Baptists. Men like Thomas Helwys. Helwys was one of the leaders of the original Baptist movement in 17th century England. In 1612, Helwys wrote the first book-length defense of religious liberty, entitled A Short Declaration of the Mystery of Iniquity. There were men like Roger Williams. In 1638, he founded what is considered the very first Baptist church in the American colonies, the First Baptist Church of Providence, which still exists today. In 1644, Williams wrote a book entitled The Bloody Tenet of Persecution, which called for the religious liberty of all people. There was Isaac Backus. Backus was a Baptist pastor in Massachusetts during the days of the American Revolution. In 1773, Backus wrote a pamphlet entitled An Appeal to the Public for Religious Liberty Against the Oppressions of the Present Day. And then there was John Leland. Leland was a friend of Backus and a Baptist evangelist in Virginia. Leland was also a friend of a couple of men you may have heard of, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. Leland wrote a widely distributed tract called The Rights of Conscience Inalienable, in which he argued that unless the government can answer for individuals on the day of judgment, it should stay out of religious matters. Leland also lobbied Madison and Jefferson to include religious liberty protections in the U.S. Constitution, patterned after those that were in the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. So in other words, if you love the First Amendment as we have it today, think a Baptist. So why are Baptists so concerned about religious liberty? Well, partially that's because of our past experience as a persecuted minority. It may be hard to believe today, with Southern Baptists being the largest Protestant denomination in the United States with millions of members, but the early Baptists were always a minority and nearly always at odds with the official state church. For example, in 1770, 10 Baptist pastors were imprisoned in the county jail in Culpeper, Virginia. Their crime? Preaching without the approval of what is now the Episcopal Church, at the time, which was the official state church of Virginia. When I lived in Louisiana, there were stories from within living memory, in other words, from within 3 generations, of Baptist preachers getting physically assaulted and run out of some of the more rural Catholic villages in Louisiana. Think of it this way. It's easy to be a volunteer fan in Knoxville. It's a lot harder to be a volunteer fan in Tuscaloosa. Imagine if Tuscaloosa passed laws requiring everyone who lived there to be an Alabama fan. Imagine not being allowed to meet with other UT fans to watch a Vols game in Tuscaloosa. Imagine being fined for wearing your big orange t-shirt in public. Imagine being arrested for singing Rocky Top. Imagine not being able to hold a job or buy a house or drive a car unless you could vouch that you pulled for the University of Alabama. Now, under such a scenario, what would your options be? Well, you could convert and become a Bama fan. Of course, that would be anathema to most true Orange Tennessee fans. You could outwardly yell Roll Tide while continuing to sing Rocky Top in secret. Or you could cheer for the Vols openly and risk persecution and prosecution. Or you could just simply move out of town. But does any of that seem fair? Because Baptists historically have faced persecution and prosecution for our beliefs, we want to protect everyone's freedom of conscience. And as Baptists, we believe those principles derive from Scripture. We believe that all people are created in the image of God, and we base that in Genesis 1:27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Part of being created in God's image is to possess both a basic human dignity and a capacity to seek after God. We also believe the Bible teaches that each person is accountable to God uniquely and personally. In Luke 12, verses 4 and 5, Jesus said, "Now I say to you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, and after that have nothing more they can do. But I will warn you whom to fear. Fear the one who, after he's killed someone, has the power to throw that person into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him." In other words, we should fear God more than we fear the opinions of other human beings. Or how about James 4:12, where James says there's only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and to destroy. But who are you judging your neighbor? In other words, every one of us has accountability before our Creator. Or Paul in Romans 14, verses 3 through 5. where he says, the one who eats is not to regard with contempt the one who does not eat, and the one who does not eat is not to judge the one who eats, for God has accepted him. Who are you to judge the servant of another? To his own master he stands or falls, and he will stand, for the Lord is able to make him stand. One person values one day over another, another values every day the same. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. That reminds us that we each have a conscience that we have to be able to justify before God and not before other human beings. Baptists also believe the Bible teaches that true faith cannot be coerced. Hebrews 11:6 tells us, without faith it is impossible to please him. For the one who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he proves to be the one who rewards those who seek him. In Acts 4, verses 19 through 20, Peter and John were called before the authorities for preaching the gospel openly. And Peter and John answered and said to them, whether it's right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, make your own judgment. For we cannot stop speaking about what we've seen and heard. A little later, they were facing persecution again for preaching the gospel. And when they were before the authorities, according to Acts 5:29, Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. In Galatians 1 verse 10, Paul said, for am I now seeking the favor of people or of God? Am I striving to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. Experience has shown that a coerced faith is either a false faith or it's a shallow faith. And we believe as Baptists, the Bible teaches the state has no business coming between the individual conscience and God. Jesus said this plainly when he was asked a question about whether or not it was right to pay taxes. And in Matthew 22, verse 21, he said to them, pay to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God. In other words, the church and the state have separate God-ordained spheres of influence. And liberty is maximized when the church doesn't intrude on the state sphere and the state doesn't intrude upon the church's sphere. So that's why Baptists have the formulation of a free church in a free state. The often used phrase that you may have heard, this wall of separation between church and state, may not appear in the Bible, but the principle is actually suggested in Jesus' words about rendering unto Caesar. While we're at it, contrary to popular belief, the wall of separation phrase doesn't appear in the U.S. Constitution either. So where does it come from? Well, that phrase actually comes from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to some Baptist friends in Danbury, Connecticut in 1802. And from the letter, it's clear that Jefferson's wall was not intended to protect the state from encroachment by the church. Instead, it was to protect the church from encroachment by the state. In Revelation 13, verses 1 through 18, we have the prediction of a future world in which a ruler will attempt to direct worship away from God and toward himself. And this ruler is labeled in that passage as the beast. And we can see both in the Old Testament and the New Testament and throughout human history, whenever a human government attempts to usurp the place of God, the results often become beastly and bloody. And we have multiple examples of history of what that looks like. So what does religious liberty look like? Well, true religious liberty recognizes and respects inherent human freedoms, including the freedom to believe as your conscience dictates, which also includes the freedom to be wrong. It includes the freedom to associate with others who share your beliefs. It includes the freedom to worship as your beliefs prescribe, and the freedom for your beliefs to shape your actions in the public sphere, as long as your expression of liberty doesn't interfere with the liberty of other people. In the United States, our courts have defined limited circumstances where the state may legitimately inhibit religious liberty. The government can only inhibit religious liberty for a compelling state interest, such as preserving the liberty of other people or protecting public safety. For example, what if a person proclaimed that his religion called on him to kill people with red hair wherever he found them? Well, in that case, the state would have a compelling interest in protecting people with red hair. The courts have also established that when the state does intervene, it must do so in the least restrictive means available. So we need to address the question, is religious liberty today under threat? Honestly, that depends on your perspective. In some ways, religious liberty in the United States has never been stronger. In recent years, religious liberty advocates have enjoyed an impressive string of victories at the United States Supreme Court. Most recently in Mahmoud versus Taylor, just about a year ago this time. And that case held that school systems have to give parents the ability to opt their children out of instruction, especially in areas of sexual morality that violates their family's religious beliefs. On the other hand, there are some ominous clouds on the horizon. As fewer Americans identify as being religious, there are fewer who appreciate the value of religious liberty. There are also those who seek to impose a militant secularism on American society, and in doing that, to drive all religious interests out of the public square. On the other side of the debate are a small but growing group who argue that America should alter the Constitution to establish Christianity as the official religion of the United States. That begs the question, though, of which version of Christianity, who gets to choose, and what happens to people who hold to differing expressions of Christian belief. Will their beliefs be outlawed? There's also the experience of Europe, where several countries have official state churches, but that's done little to stem the tide of secularism and atheism. Considering these challenges, people of faith need to be vigilant and protective of our right to religious liberty. Our forefathers left us a tremendous heritage of religious liberty. We need to avoid the mistake of Esau, whose story we read about in Genesis 25, where he traded away his birthright for a bowl of beans. We can trade away our religious liberty birthright through neglect and ignorance. We can trade away our birthright by cozying up too closely to government in the attempt to advance heavenly goals by earthly power. If we neglect our right to religious liberty, we might wake up one day to find we no longer possess that liberty. So how can we protect religious liberty? Well, first, by exercising your own religious liberty rights. Second, by defending religious liberty for everyone. Sometimes that means speaking up on behalf of people with whom we disagree. A few years ago, there was a widely watched court case which involved a community in New Jersey, and they were accused of unfairly using zoning laws to prevent a Muslim group from building a mosque. A couple of our Southern Baptist entities actually filed court briefs supporting the right of the Muslim group, and that brought them all kinds of grief. A lot of people criticized them for arguing, hey, you're using our missions money to help Muslims spread their religion. One could look at it from that perspective, or you could look at it from the perspective that our entities were not supporting Muslims in preaching their faith, but protecting our right to preach our faith. Because law is a double-edged sword. And trust me, in an increasingly secularized society, any law that could restrict Muslims from building a mosque potentially could be used to prevent Christians from building a church. There are communities where that would happen. If you're really concerned about another religious group actively spreading their message in America, the answer is not to pass a law that violates everybody's religious liberty. The real answer is to vigorously exercise our own religious liberty by actively sharing Jesus loudly and proudly with as many people as possible. And that brings us to the next way to protect religious liberty: live faithfully for Jesus regardless. Sadly, human history shows us that religious liberty is not guaranteed. However, the power of the gospel demonstrates the fact that it often spreads fastest in those societies that seek the hardest to stamp it out. If we're boldly living out the message of Jesus, as well as proclaiming it, even in the face of persecution, other people are going to be drawn to it. We can't proclaim Jesus with our lips and then deny him with our hands. For our witness to be effective, our walk must match our talk. There is a slavery that can exist even in the midst of freedom. Even in the freest nation on earth, people find themselves enslaved to their own passions, the pursuit of pleasure, their possessions, or the opinions of other people. However, there's also a freedom that can exist even in the face of the most adverse slavery. Other people can control your body, but unless you allow them, they cannot control your soul. And when you give your soul to Jesus, you can experience a freedom that no government, no matter how beastly, can take away. As Jesus said in John 8, verse 36, if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. So come to Jesus and experience true freedom today. If you want to know more, feel free to reach out to us in the comments or send me an email at pastor@newsalembaptist.net. Thanks for joining us today.